Hey guys, it has definitely been a long weekend, but I need to start doing these videos more often, get some of these out here. Um, I've got a couple of larger books that I'm working on, so what I thought I would do in the interim is get you some of these short stories. The first one here is Andrew Grave and the Last Link. If you're curious why the weekend's been long, stay tuned for the next video. Attention, please. Will all visitors kindly leave the ship now? The Carmania is about to sail. James Monroe, standing in the thronged main lobby of the great liner, watched carefully as people around him began to make their last farewells and drift toward the gangway. He was a broad-shouldered, muscular man of medium height, 40 years old, good-looking and alert. He wore a dark gray suit with a pale gray shirt and a gray tie. He looked very respectable. The loudspeaker cracked once again. "All visitors ashore, please. All visitors ashore." Choosing his moment, Monroe joined a group of people moving to the gangway and left the ship with them. Ashore, an officer hand stretched out to collect the visitors' permits. Monroe gave his up. Then, with a sudden, "Heavens! I've left my briefcase behind. I'll be back in a moment." He turned and dived back through the crowd, glancing round as he re-entered the ship. He failed to detect any ripple of disturbance behind him. He made it. He was back on board, and there would be nothing in the records to show it. He picked up his briefcase and a cloth-covered, zip-fastened bundle, and then went out to the afterdeck to watch the departure. The visitors were lining the quasi-side now, waving handkerchiefs, shouting last messages. The passengers were lining the rail, hundreds of them. A long blast came from the siren. The gangways were hoisted ashore, the ropes cast off. A tug's screw began to turn. Slowly, the liner drew out into the Hudson River, out into the harbor, out past the Statue of Liberty. The New York skyline faded in the autumn haze. Next stop, Southampton. A man standing beside Monroe said to his wife, "I think we'd better go and book our table, dear." And they moved away. Monroe, fingering the raised wheel of a scar across the back of his right hand, smiled grimly to himself. He'd have liked to book a table too, but he couldn't, because he hadn't paid his fare, because he hadn't a cabin number to give, because he hadn't any right to be on board at all, and that was how it was going to be for 6 days. The first thing he decided was to find some place to hide his bundle. He couldn't possibly carry it around with him for a week. It was 30 inches long, 12 inches high, and 18 inches wide. Far too bulky. Where would it attract the least attention? Monroe set off to explore the tourist quarters of the two-class ship, the lounges, the bars, the theater, the library, the swimming bath, the gymnasium, the lavatories. As he'd rather expected, it was up on the sun deck that he found the best answer to his problem. Below the rail, lifeboats hung in their davits. He would hide the bundle in one of the boats. Openly, while people were still busy with their own problems after the departure, Monroe fetched a bundle and left it on a seat on the sun deck. No one took any notice of him. Then, after dark, he returned there, having first made sure he had the deck to himself. He lowered the bundle into one of the boats on a length of tarred string, and lowered the string on a length of black twine, which he tied to the bottom rail. He wasn't entirely happy about the hiding place, but it was the best he could do. During the next few days, Monroe applied himself with zest to the task of living illegally aboard a great ship without arousing any suspicion. He had briefed himself on the ship's routine before embarking on the enterprise, and, as he'd foreseen, there was no serious problem about the food. He couldn't enter the dining room, but he could drink hot bouillon on the promenade deck at 10:30 each morning, and have coffee in the lounge at 11. He could get nuts and tidbits with his aperitif at 12, and tea and biscuits at 4, and unlimited sandwiches from a buffet in the main lobby at night. All with no questions asked. It was rather a starchy diet, but at least he wouldn't starve. Disposing of his person proved no great problem either. In daytime, he had the run of the tourist class like any other of the 800 passengers. He looked like a passenger and behaved like a passenger. There was no reason why anyone should be suspicious of him. At night, the hazards were slightly greater, but the nights were short. There was dancing until 2 o'clock each morning, and some people stayed up long after that, giving him good cover. There was actually only an hour or two when he had to make himself scarce in order not to be conspicuous. Generally, he found a sheltered seat on the afterdeck, and when, around dawn, sailors came to swab down, he simply moved away until they'd finished. They showed no surprise. It wasn't unusual, after all, for a passenger affected by the motion of the ship to seek fresh air at any hour. Sitting out there was cold and uncomfortable, but that was an inescapable part of the enterprise. In the mornings, Monroe found himself an easy chair in one of the lounges and dozed peacefully, catching up on his sleep. By day, he spent a good deal of time in the library, where he could bury himself in a magazine without risk of disturbance. He became a regular attender of films. The cinema was a snug, safe retreat for 2 performances each day. He took in 2 concerts and 1 church service. He exercised gently in the gymnasium. He avoided all organized social events like bingo sessions and horse racing and competitive games. Throughout, he continued to look well-dressed and personable. He had found a small, rarely used lavatory on the sun deck where he could safely wash and shave behind a locked door. And in his briefcase, he had all the necessities. He even had a gray shirt, which he changed into in midweek. The only real danger, he soon discovered, was of becoming involved with some other passenger against his will. Aboard ship, people are friendly and chatty and inquisitive. So from the beginning, Monroe walked alone. He stalked around with a blanket, unwelcoming face, keeping his distance, avoiding conversation, meeting any advance with frosty brevity. Even so, there were moments of difficulty. There was a Lanchester salesman traveling alone, who, at the merest nod from Monroe, had buttonholed him and started to pour out his life history. That had been on the 2nd day, and Monroe had found it hard to detach himself. Always after that, he had kept a weather eye open for the man, to avoid him. Once he had been almost caught on the main deck, but he had slipped into a jewelry shop and talked briefly about aquamarines to the glamorous brunette behind the counter, while the danger passed. Otherwise, everything seemed to be going well for him. It was on the 4th day out that Monroe was caught off guard and found himself in real trouble. The weather had deteriorated, and the ship was pitching. Monroe, late in the evening, was taking a constitutional along the covered promenade deck. Several other people were doing the same thing. As he approached the open deck, where a girl was standing, the ship gave a sudden lurch. The girl grabbed the nearest thing for support, which happened to be Monroe. Monroe lost his balance and fell, striking his knee on the deck. He got up painfully. The girl, he saw, was the brunette from the jewelry shop. "I'm so sorry," she said. "Are you all right?" Monroe, rubbing his knee, assured her that he was. "It was stupid of me. I ought to be holding the rail." "Oh dear, you're limping." "It's nothing," Monroe said. The other strollers had joined them, and he feared a fuss. He began to move away. The girl walked with him. "You've gone quite pale. You don't think you ought to see the nurse?" "No, really, I'm quite all right." Monroe hobbled on. The girl still looked doubtful. "Well, I shall ring you in the morning just to make sure." "I assure you it isn't necessary." "It's the least I can do. I insist. What's your cabin number?" For a second, Monroe hesitated. Then he said 575, choosing one at random, and forced a smile and limped into the waiting lift. The damage to his knee was slight, as he had said, but the other damage wasn't. He felt no surprise next evening when the girl, now off duty, finally caught up with him in the main lounge. She gave him a slightly puzzled smile. "How's the knee today?" "Quite better, thank you." "I did ring the cabin, but I must have misheard the number. It wasn't yours." She paused. "I thought you said 575. Monroe gave her a haunted look. "Well, no," he began. Suddenly he grinned and gave up. "Look, why don't we have a drink? What's your name?" "Barney. Amanda Burney. What's yours?" "James Monroe." "I'd love to have a drink," she said. Monroe called a steward and gave the orders. "Well, Miss Burney," he said, "it looks as though I'll have to take you into my confidence. You forced my hand. The fact is, I haven't got a cabin." "Not a cabin?" "No, and I haven't paid my fare." Amanda's dark eyes opened wide in astonishment. "You can't mean you're a stowaway," she said. "Well, yes, in a sense. I suppose that I am." The girl put down her drink. She looked most upset. "But this is awful. How can you be so calm about it? And why did you do it? You don't look like a stowaway." "It's quite simple, really," Monroe said. "I'm on an initiative test." "What on earth's that?" "I'm in the Army, the intelligence branch. Every now and again we're given tasks to test our initiative. Most are fairly easy, but this one's a snorter. We were dumped in New York and told to get home by sea or air without buying a ticket and without showing a passport. That's what I'm doing." "You're not serious." "I'm perfectly serious, so you can relax. It's all on the level. I've the whole authority of the War Office behind me. They'll see me through whatever happens. The question is, will you? If you give me away, I fail the test. Otherwise, I may be able to make it." "Well, I've never heard anything like it. How did you get aboard?" Monroe told her. There are probably other ways, but that worked quite well. "How will you get ashore at Southampton?" "You'll never do that, you know. The immigration people come aboard. You have to show your passport to get a landing card. You haven't a hope." Monroe gave a smug smile. "I'm not going to Southampton," he said. "I'm going to drop off before we get there." "Drop off?" "Yes. As we go up Spithead, I gather we're due there just before dawn. I've got an inflatable rubber boat with me." "Good heaven!" "It's in a bundle up in one of the lifeboats, I hope. It is a patent thing, inflates automatically when it touches the water. I shall jump in with it and paddle ashore. The paddles are inside it." Amanda shook her head incredulously. "It sounds utterly crazy to me. You'll probably drown." "I don't think so. I hope that you're a good swimmer. That's all." As a matter of fact, Monroe said. I'm a rotten swimmer. But the boat's reliable. I've tested it. Works like a miracle. All you have to do is climb in, and the ship will be going very slowly up Spithead. Don't forget, probably only a few knots. It'll be easy to jump. I'll be ashore and reporting my success before the ship berths in the morning. That is, if you'll give me a break and keep quiet about me. Amanda looked at him uncertainly. Where does this initiative come in if you rely on me? Oh, the rules allow us to make use of anyone who can along the route. As a matter of fact, if you are going to help me, there's something else you might do. Hide my bundle under your bed till I need it? I'm scared stiff that one of the sailors might notice that thread. It's a lot to ask, Amanda said. I'll probably get the sack if anyone should find out. You won't, I assure you. The War Office will see to that. Well, I'll sleep on it. I'll let you know my answer tomorrow. When Monroe looked in at the shop the next morning, Amanda greeted him with a welcoming smile. She'd thought it over and said she'd decided she wouldn't give him away, and she would look after his bundle for him. That's my girl, Monroe said. Then I'll bring it down to the promenade deck exactly at 9 tonight. I'll leave it by the seat just outside the foyer door, and you can take it from there, okay? And thanks a lot. See you later. The transfer that evening went very smoothly. The sun deck was empty when Monroe arrived there to haul the bundle up. 10 minutes after he'd placed it by the seat, it had gone. Amanda joined him in the lounge a little later, with a conspiratorial air. All safe, she said. Monroe ordered drinks, and they talked for a long time. Monroe talked mainly of the army. Amanda was amusing about her work on the ship. She was, it soon appeared, an intelligent and sophisticated girl, as well as a beautiful one. Presently they started to dance, and they danced till after midnight. For both of them it was a memorable evening. Now the last day had come. The end of the journey was in sight. The ship was nearing the Isle of Wight. On schedule. The weather was good, and the sea was calm. Monroe had timed his jump for 5 in the morning. Amanda was to bring the bundle to the afterdeck immediately after 2 o'clock, when the dancing stopped, and Monroe would meet her there and take over. She appeared on deck promptly at 10 minutes past 2, carrying the bundle, and sat down beside him on the seat, where so often he'd spent the early hours of the morning. Her voice, as she greeted him, sounded a bit shaky. What's the matter? He asked. Feeling nervous? Yes, I am. I wish you wouldn't do it, James. I think it's absolutely mad. Nonsense, Monroe assured her. It will be easy. But it's not so far to jump, she said, and you might get caught in the propellers. Anything. It seems such a stupid risk for an initiative test. It isn't as though there's anything big at stake, she sighed. Still, I don't suppose I can persuade you. I'm afraid not, Monroe said, and paused. Maybe I ought to come clean with you now. You're right. There is a slight risk. For an initiative test, it would be stupid. The truth is, I'm not on an initiative test. I made that up, actually. I'm a police officer, a detective, inspector on duty. Amanda stared at him. I'm afraid I don't understand. It's quite simple. I'm investigating a murder. A murder that took place on this ship 3 months ago. You must know about it. You mean Miss Everett? Right. The woman who was strangled in her cabin on her way back from New York the night before the ship docked. I expect you remember all the questioning aboard afterwards, but it didn't lead anywhere. After a while, I was put in charge of the case. There was one curious piece of evidence that I couldn't get out of my mind. Maybe you heard about it at the time. The murderer, whoever he was, slipped into Miss Everett's cabin only a split second before a woman in the next cabin came out, and Miss Everett was heard to exclaim, "Ralph!" before her doors closed. Now, Ralph happens to be the name of the nephew Miss Everett lived with before her death. Of course, she might just have been calling out the name of a man she knew, a sort of hopeless cry for help as she was attacked. But the witness was quite emphatic that the cry was one of surprise, just as though Miss Everett had seen someone of that name unexpectedly appear. Well, she couldn't possibly have seen her nephew, if that's what you're thinking, Amanda said. He wasn't on board. I remember that was brought out. I know, Monroe said. All the same, this bit of evidence nagged at me, and I thought I might as well find out just where Ralph Everett was at the time. A few weeks ago, I went to see him at the home he shared with his aunt on the Kent coast. He's supposed to be in the import-export business, but he struck me as a playboy. Good-looking, vigorous, athletic type. Does a good deal of sailing. According to him, he was on a dingy camping holiday by himself while his aunt was in New York, where she'd been visiting a friend. I was able to check his departure and return in the dinghy, but not the time in between. And he couldn't produce any witness. I began to wonder if I might be on the track of an elaborate plot. Miss Everett's death would have been worth a plot to him. She nearly left $500,000, and it's now all his. And it would have had to be elaborate to keep him in the clear, because as her heir he would be the obvious suspect. Anyway, I tried to work something out. I thought he might have flown to New York on a false passport. He'd been in trouble with the police once before over a passport offense. I discovered, though naturally, he hadn't told his aunt about it. And if he did fly to New York, I thought maybe he could have contrived to come back on the Camara secretly. Amanda gave a little nod. Now I begin to see, as you've done. Exactly. That's what I've been testing. Whether it was feasible, the last link in the chain, or perhaps I should say the last link but one. Now I'm pretty sure it was feasible. He could have brought one of the self-inflating boats. He certainly knew about them. I spotted one in the shed where he'd kept his boat gear. But if he'd been aboard the ship, Amanda said, his aunt would have seen him around, long before she was killed. Not if he traveled tourist. She was traveling first class, as he knew. He booked the return passage for her. Surely someone here, some of the stewards, would have remembered his face, though. Haven't they been showing pictures of him? Some of them have, yes. One even said he thought the face was a bit familiar. But he wasn't certain. It would have been easy enough for Everett to have fixed up some simple disguise. Heavy glasses, a bit of a beard. Amanda seemed doubtful. I must say it all sounds frightfully dangerous to me. $500,000's worth. Quite a bit of danger. But suppose someone had discovered his inflatable boat, assuming that he had one. You certainly have been worried enough about yours. If anything at all had gone wrong, Monroe said, he naturally wouldn't have committed the murder. As for the boat, he was in a much better position than I. He wouldn't have had to hide his bundle in a lifeboat at all. Oh? No. There's quite a lot I haven't told you yet. It seems that for some time before the murder, Everett was in the habit of staying away from home for a couple of nights about every fortnight. On business, he said. I discovered that he always spent these periods in Southampton. I found the hotel where he stayed, and learned that he'd been seen there with a young woman once or twice. I couldn't get an exact description of her, only that she was dark and very attractive. I also discovered that these visits of his coincide with the times that this ship was turning around at Southampton. It almost seemed as though the girl might be someone off the Carmina. Someone, perhaps, that he'd met on the ship. When I looked into that aspect, I found that about 6 months ago, Everett crossed on the Carmina on his way back from a business trip to New York. You see how everything begins to tie up? He'd even have known the routine of the ship, and of course, if he'd had an accomplice aboard, some adventurers who was given to share the loot with him. He could easily have given her the bundle right from the start. It's fascinating, Amanda said. Please go on. Well, Monroe continued, when I came aboard, I naturally kept my eyes open for this possible accomplice. I rather doubted that she'd be a stewardess. They're usually not quite the type. I imagine Everett would probably have told her about me, how I'd grilled him and described me. Monroe fingered the scar on his right hand. And I'm easily identifiable. I thought that if the girl existed and was still working on the ship, and if she saw me and this scar, she would probably approach me sooner or later because she'd want to find out what I was up to. He paused. Amanda didn't speak. Well, you approached me. You recognized me in the shop, of course. You stumbled against me on the deck deliberately to get on talking terms. You tried to pump me, and I invented the initiative test. When you agreed to keep my secret and hide the bundle for me, I felt pretty certain you were the accomplice. I couldn't believe any employee would take such responsibility with a stranger unless she had some ulterior motive. Of course, you knew the story wasn't true anyway. You knew by then that I was reconstructing Everett's trip, that the net was closing. There was a little silence. Then Amanda said, You spoke of the last link but one? What is the last link? Do I need to tell you? Monroe picked up the black bundle. I left this with the zip slightly undone. Now it's pulled tight. He took off the cloth cover and raised the rubber boat up to the light. Right under the inflator nozzle, a 4-inch square piece of rubber had been roughly hacked out of the fabric with scissors or a knife. I felt sure the temptation would prove too much for you, Monroe said. It would have given you and Everett time to make your getaway. Of course. Well, there it is. Miss Burney, I am now arresting you for being concerned with Ralph Everett and the murder of his aunt, Edith Everett. And I have to warn you that anything you say may be used in evidence. He took her arm, firmly, but not roughly, and led her below. It's kind of an interesting little detective story there. Again, that was The Last Link by Andrew Grave. Stay tuned. We've got a few more of these short little detective-type stories. Thank you guys very much for staying tuned, and you have a wonderful and blessed day.